Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. My name is Sam Johnson. I'm the Managing Director here at Impact Policy. And before we go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge country. I want to take a moment to pay respects to Bidjigal country, where this podcast has been recorded today. I also want to extend that respect to all our viewers and listeners and the country that you're on as well. I want to recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It was never ceded by treaty. Today's episode, I'm lucky to be joined by my colleague and friend, Sean McCarthy. He works alongside us here as the Director of Policy and Strategy at Impact Policy, and we're going to take a deep dive into CoDesign. CoDesign is an area that we work closely in alongside many of our clients in the public sector. We get approached and reached out to, and in many ways, not going to say experts in the field because we're constantly learning, but we're definitely building a strong, portfolio of projects and experiences where we've been able to do this work really well, and also learn some significant things along the way for where we can build and understand and do that work better too. So I've worked alongside Sean for a number of years, but today's episode really sort of takes a deep dive into CoDesign. If you've followed this podcast series for a long time, you would have seen that we've done some significant episodes already with thought leaders and practice leaders in this space, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And this episode with Sean really builds on that, takes a deeper dive into what that looks like, and really tries to hone in on some of the practice experiences that we've been having over the last 12 months, and where that can really add value for people listening along as well. We really believe in the power of CoDesign when it's done well with authenticity and with integrity too. And so we really believe that there's some lessons in here that can add value for listeners along the way on their own journeys too. And we hope you enjoy it. Hope you get something out of it. And if you have any questions at all and you want to reach out, please reach out to myself or Sean, and we can have a yarn in more detail about anything CoDesign as well. While I've got you, I'm going to point down the camera and beg you to please subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We completely self-fund this whole podcast series, and any support that we get along the way goes a really, really long way in terms of getting this to as many people as possible. So if you listen along, if you can please follow and rate the podcast series, if you get value out of it on Spotify, that would be amazing. If you watch on YouTube, please subscribe to the content. It means you'll get notified straight away as soon as new content comes out. And we really, really want to make sure that we're building stuff that really adds value as well. We promise we're not going to try and sell you anything. We really just want to share as much knowledge and as much value as well with our communities as possible. So thank you so much. If I can just ask you that one little thing, that's all I'll ever do. Hope you enjoy the episode. Thank you. So I thought the best part about getting us together today would be because we've had so much, interest, energy, enthusiasm around CoDesign and the work that we've been doing. And I know that, we shared recently some of the work that we've done with some of the student placements through a blog, just trying to share some of that knowledge with our audience on LinkedIn. That received, really strong engagement. And we're also doing some significant sort of CoDesign work at the moment. And we haven't really held a podcast space to, further explore what we do around CoDesign since the work that we did with Nelly and with KA last year. So I thought it would be fitting to try and get, yourself on, another face of Impact Policy, another mind behind sort of how we do what we do, to have a yarn about that stuff in more detail. But for anyone who probably hasn't come across yourself, maybe we could take a moment. You could just introduce who you are, where you're from, what you do at Impact Policy, and just a bit of an intro.
So I'm Sean. I'm a Gumbaynggirr Bunjalung man living on Gadigal country in Petersham. I've been at Impact since January when you brought me across, and it's been a breath of fresh air since. I had a government background, worked in government, state government for 10 years in project management, program management, grants, policy, so a pretty broad range of areas. And then I worked in federal government for 2 years before that. But yeah, I'm a director of policy and strategy, is it? At Impact.
Close enough, yeah.
I think my letter of offer actually said research and policy, so I sort of interchanged my title a little bit.
You and me
but-
both, don't worry.
Yeah, but yeah, obviously just working alongside you in policy development, really. So that's sort of a bit about my background. I grew up in between Sydney. I spent a couple of years in Grafton and a year in Coffs, and so that's sort of a bit about where I've been geographically as well, or lived.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, for those listening along online, Sean and I worked together for a number of years, worked on some really significant public projects around our language and culture and Aboriginal affairs, and got to really see some significant work together as well. So having the opportunity to bring Sean across, you know, was massive for us, because it meant that we knew we were getting someone in the team who, you know, had a really strong background professionally, culturally, and everything in between as well. So yeah, so lucky to have you with us on the team and doing some of the amazing work that we're doing. And I think that comes to, I guess, the purpose of today, because really I feel, and you'd probably be the same, is that the work that we're doing in the co-design space is probably increasing.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. I think a lot of people are starting to look to impact policy for advice and guidance around co-design and doing that well, particularly with our communities.
Yeah.
And I guess with that, you know, probably this podcast might be just a bit of an opportunity for us to explore in more detail what that looks like, because it is still one of them areas, hey, that can be a bit fraught.
Contentious, yeah.
Contentious, polite way of putting it, yeah. In many different ways, and so this is like a precursor to the conversations we've already had on this series, but I guess it's probably one that's updated now, because since then we have delivered some significant co-design pieces of work, largely for the public sector, and so we've got you know, learning and advice and knowledge that we can share and talk to there as well. But maybe we just kick off, like talk and just start like at the start, like how would we describe what co-design even means? Because I know before impact policy, it was one of those words that was, you know, it could mean many, thrown around a lot and mean a lot of different things. So how would you describe it, Brad?
I think that's a pretty diplomatic way of putting it.
Very diplomatic on this podcast, I think.
I mean, I think what we've had a bit of a discussion on it, and your description of it being community-led, authentically community-led, Guri-led is probably an apt description. I think that it really is about Guri people, our mob, having a voice and a leading say in policy design or program design and implementation as well. So that's how I would view it. I don't know if that's a real definition, but that's sort of what when I think of co-design, that's kind of what springs to mind.
Yeah. No, I hear you 100%, because, you know, essentially, like if I think about the word, and I think about what I've you know, learned in the past from, you know, practitioners like KA and for other learning as well, it's you know, you look at that co piece, is that, you know, it's community, it's collaboration, coming together, and essentially it's you know, and then it's the design piece, right? There's an element of something that we have created.
Yeah.
Something has, you know, been created as a result of that relationship or engagement or time together. And so, yeah, co-design comes back for me to yeah, it's creating something through collaboration and through coming together. But what you talk about, 100% resonates, because I think it comes, particularly that language you used around community-led.
Yeah.
Because sometimes so much of what I feel is co-design in our communities is actually
Government-led.
Yeah.
Or organisation-led. Non-Guri organisation.
Totally.
That leads it. And that, you know, I think that's exactly right. I think that's why it's become, like you said, a bit of a dirty word in community, because it's been misused and misinterpreted, and really it's not used authentically. If co-design is used authentically, it has huge potential to meet the needs of our mob. And, you know, you can't really determine need or aspiration of a particular group without actually speaking to them. Co-design is a mechanism to actually identify that need and aspiration and come up with a solution to do it. Otherwise, you're just having a bit of a shot in the dark. It's inaccurate. It's a inefficient way to construct policy and design policy, because really policies develop to meet needs, isn't it? It's a solution to a not always an issue, but it's really, policy design is a solution. You're creating solutions to sometimes issues, or you're creating a pathway to an outcome. You can't really do that effectively and efficiently without actually speaking to the people who the policy is meant to service, who the policy is meant to benefit. So
absolutely.
In policy design space, I guess we speak about that a bit more being an impact, because it's sort of our core role, but I think it has to be authentic, and it's really a way to ensure that what you're doing is accurate and what you're doing is effective. So a bit different to my original point, but I think that's sort of a big reason why we need to do it properly.
Yeah, definitely. And I hear what you know what comes up, the more we have these conversations with our people and in our communities, the more I keep hearing the phrase community-led.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny because people will think about those two sort of methods in isolation of each other.
Yeah.
Co-design and community-led. And it's funny because I think but if I talk to non-Aboriginal practitioners in a co-design space, I won't hear the words language community-led. But with our people, I always hear it. And I think it comes back exactly what you said earlier, like a big part of what makes co-design meaningful is when it is led and informed by our communities. And I think the biggest challenge with that, particularly for our work, because we work with the public sector for the most part in doing this, is that, I guess, elephant in the room around power.
Yeah, yeah.
And around how for, the last 200 plus years, there's been this gross imbalance of power in terms of engagement with our communities.
Yeah.
So really talking about co-design implies that there's an equal balance, right? You're coming together, but there's this gross power imbalance, whether consciously or unconsciously, that exists with our communities and with government for a range of reasons that we don't need to go into right now. But I think that's where, like, when you use that language community led, that's where for me I really feel like co-design is authentic, because that's where, like, the most agency, the most authority, the most power and responsibility we can give to our communities in those engagement processes or co-design journeys, the more that you feel that there's going to be a rebalance to where we get to at the end of it.
I think that's a really good point, because it is a mechanism to sort of rebalance that power discrepancy between government and community, and discrepancies are like too light of a word that I use there, but it's a way to have agency, or for a mob to have agency in what's being produced. And I think that's one of the direct benefits of co-design work, and something that we should be pushing more of. I think as well, when it's done properly and when it's done authentically, you're really able to, or communities able, I should say, to determine how something's implemented, what is implemented, determine the level of governance and the structure of governance that they have over a process or an implementation process, determine how something's evaluated, even the parameters of that evaluation. Really, it's coming back to community control, and again, if it's done authentically, you almost broaden the scope at the start of the process to ensure that whatever you're doing actually captures the needs of the community and really captures what they want to focus on as well. Because I guess being in the public sector for so long, and I was probably guilty of this myself, it's something that is taken for granted, too often taken for granted. Government perceives an issue. They come into community with a preconceived notion, solution already developed to a problem that might not exist, or at least might not be prioritized by community. Have a very narrow scope for consultation and involvement and engagement, really no agency for community built into that process, and then essentially slap the term co-design on it to make it more palatable. And
thinking of some specific projects that we've been involved in.
And that's why we don't get the outcome, why government doesn't get the outcomes in policy when it comes to anything Aboriginal related. It's why there's not really progress in a lot of areas for our people, because of poor policy design. And it really comes back to a poor process. Because co-design really for me is also a process. Like it's something that we overlook too often. We sort of look at it, then there certainly is a methodology to it as well, but we ignore the process, and we don't put enough focus or onus or really prioritization on the process of co-design, and that impacts the quality of the policy design.
Yeah, and you make a couple of really interesting points that are quite practical, I think, for people that are listening in terms of I guess how you engage and interact in the co-design world. So like we just talked about process there, and then we talk about what that looks like from a co-design space. And I guess one of the challenges we talk about often is, particularly we get engaged by the public sector, they really want to do something that's co-designed, but they also want to outline every deliverable and every variable and measurable as part of project plan, as part of contract development, all that stuff, which is understandable.
Yeah,
we get it, but the reality is, right, like we've talked about, is that if something is truly co-designed, like we can't determine what that is. That is, and yeah, I think that sort of reinforces that one of the challenges that we're navigating. And I mean, you talked about being victim of it yourself when you're in the public sector, and I'm the same as well. When we have to react to tight time frames. Yeah. We've been like that before. We're in a project at the moment where we had to react to this really tight time frame because of ministerial commitments and announcements, and luckily we were able to sort of, I guess, reframe a way that we could do that work that still sort of outlined a strong process for co-design. But too often than not, it is the opposite, and then you're left with this. I always think about it as the breadth and depth of co-design. So like co-design can look like a lot of things, but co-design in 4 weeks is going to look very different to co-design in 18 months.
Yeah.
And so that's when we talk about the breadth and the depth of what we might describe something as a co-designed process. And we've seen projects that we've worked on in the past where, like you touched on evaluation, and you might not be able to do a whole evaluation that's co-designed, but we've worked on projects where we've designed the methodology for a qualitative evaluation. So that's one specific part of a whole evaluation that we can, with integrity, say was co-designed. So that's an example of trying to work within those frames and meaningfully, authentically trying to do that well. But yeah, for people listening along, like that's the biggest challenge is if you're thinking that you're talking about doing something and wanting to do something co-designed, you really have to look at the environment and parameters that you've got to create to be able to do that and do that well.
That's right. Like even look, when you made a really good point, and something that I haven't touched on yet was the, timeframes and timelines. Really, if you were doing it authentically and in its purest form, you'd actually have community determining the timeframes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that then, they're probably best placed to tell you how the consultation piece should look, and that's really important because that's really the core part of what co-design is that consultation process and that engagement process. So if they're telling you it's going to take 18 months or 2 years or a year, to properly consult everyone to ensure that the concept's understood, the purpose of your work is, solid and correct or understood as well, to ensure that it's a robust discussion that you're having and different options are considered. It really comes back to community having that say in how you're meant to engage and how long a piece should be going. If you're slapping a time frame of like 4 weeks on something, or if you're not really listening to community's feedback around how long it will take to complete something or complete consultation, it's not really co-design in a pure form. Obviously there's adjustments that you can make, and sometimes community wants something quicker than what's being proposed to. So absolutely. It's not necessarily all about lengthening out timeframes, but it's more or less about listening to community's needs and adjusting to those needs and actually building that into the scope of the project as well. So when you talk about breadth and depth, I think that's a good example, because really if you want it to have the breadth and depth that it should have, then community should be involved at the first stage, which is the project design, or at least the sort of outline of how the policy project will run.
Absolutely. I think that makes me think about a couple of things. It makes me think about the like we're doing some work, whilst we won't talk specifically about the project in detail yet. The work that we're doing at the moment, we've broke into phases, and that first phase is just around engagement and communication. And in my space, in my head, I'm like, it really actually feels like, if organizations have the capacity to invest in that and provide space for that, like that's like best practice. Because for me, the work that we're doing in the community that we're doing it in, and it's around a significant, social policy issue, that involves complex needs and trauma, and a range of different things. To walk in and say we're going to co-design something together around that, for me, that there's a massive piece that occurs before that involves communication about what is even co-design, what are we trying to do together, how could it look, where should it happen, who should be involved, like all these predeterminants that I think I mentioned, hearing that that piece around choice. And, giving people choice and agency in determining how the process looks. For me, I feel like that phase we're working on now, that's really embodying that. Like we're not even designing anything yet. Like when it's not on the table, like it might, some conversations around, what is already happening or what has worked well might come up organically, and that's fantastic. But the real big part is that it's that pre-stage in terms of, building community. We use capacity loosely because our community's got, plenty of capacity. But it's that preparation for co-design and identifying, the proper way to go about doing that, that I feel is really, really valuable that we've been able to have. But too often it's not the case, right? Like I feel very privileged that we have a phase that's been included pre-co-design.
It's not the norm. Like sitting on the other side in government, it wasn't necessarily the norm in how you would manage a contract, essentially, or how you do a procurement. But it's great because you're consulting on everything. You're essentially looking at the concept, whether it's culturally appropriate or valuable, even whether there's a need for it, whether there's a want for it. And then you sort of, by extension, start looking at how it might work, what the scope of it might be, how the structure might be, whether there's any alternative solutions or options that could be scoped or considered. And then really that's just the first phase, like you said. The other phase, you can go back out and really delve into the specifics a bit more. So it's been a great project to work on or start to work on, because you really get to see co-design or implement co-design properly and authentically as well. And, that's been rare.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking as well, like since I started an Impact, there's been a lot of interest in it from government, from different community members, just different sort of like, people we engage with too.
Yeah.
Has it increased in the last couple of years? Because you've been operating now for 2.5,
Yeah, it's our third year.
3 years. So
Just into our third year now.
has there been more interest lately?
I would say that we're doing more work now more than ever in that co-design space. But since we started talking about it and, sharing, learning and thinking about it, from when we started, there's always been a strong interest, and there's always been a strong sort of audience and support, for people wanting to know more and understand more. So yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's increasing, but there's definitely a demand for people and organisations that are almost sort of, whether consciously or unconsciously thinking about co-design as best practice or as maybe an achievable way of doing something, designing something or achieving an outcome together in the best possible way. I think we all sort of probably agree that, community-led sort of agency in determining policy and, projects is always sort of best practice and ideal.
Yeah.
I think it's almost like a default sort of like we can't really achieve that maybe. So co-design is something that is more safer.
Yeah.
More realistic to get to. But yeah, I don't know. I think, but we've talked for a long time as well, and we're investing resources into building more of a knowledge base because that's why these conversations are so valuable, right? Is like one thing I have noticed is how little there is out there.
Yeah.
Particularly for our communities in terms of what this looks like when it's done well.
Yeah.
And, we'd done that, we had Daniela and Fatima who were with us doing their placements from Macquarie Uni, did an amazing job and helped us, do a bit of a literature review and build a bit of a knowledge base. But even that process was limited, very limited in terms of what was out there. I think, they came across some great work by Marnie Shea, who's an Aboriginal academic from up in Queensland, which was really valuable. But outside of that, I think one thing for us at Impact that I think is probably in the next stage in that sort of space is us, because we do research and evaluation, is us actually starting to build our own knowledge base and resources for what this means in our communities.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that'll involve us doing, some qualitative work with our people that have done this work professionally, that have maybe participated personally, and really starting to deep dive into what does this look like when it's done well.
Yeah.
And then some of the outcomes of that being a resource for practitioners. But I think more so what we talked about in terms of the value of a process like that is actually a resource for our communities.
Yeah.
So that they have some agency in terms of being able to actually determine if a process is being co-designed. So when, flash consultants like us or others or public sector professionals are coming in using that language, they have some autonomy to be like, hang on a second.
This isn't actually co-design.
This isn't co-design. If we were talking about co-design, it would look like this, or you'd be asking us that. And I think that's where I think impact policy, where the real realization has come, not so much in the increase, but just in the consistent gap.
Yeah.
I haven't seen an increase in knowledge, Yeah.
And I think actually that's a good word to use too, because a lot of it is a bit of an education piece. Like ourselves, we probably go through an education process or
Absolutely.
a learning process every single time we sort of engage in these policy areas and
absolutely
pick up contracts that involve co-design, or where we're trying to even educate government on what we think a co-design process should look like.
Totally.
I think that, when you were talking about that resource for community too, just giving community more tools to advocate, I suppose. That's a bit probably not the best way to put it, because it sounds probably a bit too altruistic and I think a bit too paternalistic. But, you know, I think developing a resource and even identifying what best practice looks like at times, it provides a bit of clarity and it provides a good reference point. So if community want, they can choose to use that as a reference point. They obviously don't have to, but it's just something, really just a point to consider, isn't it? And the more informed you can be and more clued in you can be in terms of what has worked well, just gives you a better base for negotiations, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And advocacy, really. So
Absolutely.
self advocacy, I should say. So yeah, that'll be exciting, and being able to define being able to really hone in on what's been done well and use that as an example as for us even is going to be really beneficial.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there around like we're constantly learning all the time as well. Each project we work on and piece of work we pick up, we take away something from that, and I think it really reinforces the complexity around, around when you are designing with community. And building something together, the nuance that exists from community to community, and everything in between. And so, we're not sitting here as an authority that thinks we know everything. We're really just trying to share our learning and sort of knowledge sort of journey we're on. And I think, if anything, that sort of hopefully that's a breath of fresh air for people that are listening as well, that like you're on your own journey as well, and you're going to constantly be learning and building your own skills as well from project to project, and consistently thinking about where things could have happened better, or what else could have been added to make something more stronger, and then there's always spaces for us in pieces of work that we've worked on where that's been a consideration, whether that's been out of our hands or not. And I think like even just coming back to some of that stuff we talked about with the engagement piece, like one of the biggest learnings that I got to take away from a project once was I was engaged to work on a whole of government response following a parliamentary inquiry, and they wanted this whole of government response plan to invest in community, in community development done within 6 months. And straight away we came into community. Anyway, long story short, that CoDesign piece took over 18 months. And what we realized is that first 6 months was really just engagement and relationship building.
Yeah.
It was a communication piece around the purpose and principles around why we were there and how we would do what we would do. And the outcomes that we achieved were really significant. But really the learning in that piece, luckily, because of the support and flexibility that we got within it, we were able to extend those timeframes. But had we not had that and we'd only had 6 months, the project probably would have fell over.
Yeah.
And our reflection in hindsight would have been like, oh, if we had a bit more time, we might have been able to achieve some really good stuff. And I'm sure, and I've had projects, and I'm sure you've had them as well, where that has been the case.
Yeah, definitely.
And we've walked away from that going, fuck, they gave us 6 months to do that piece of work. I mean, they gave us 6 weeks to do that piece of work, and we really just scraped the surface.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon. So if you are listening to this, don't be too hard on yourself on your learning journey in terms of how you're trying to build your knowledge and your skills, because they will only go from strength to strength as long as you're actively engaged and reflecting and trying to build on your practice methods when you think about this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and build that flexibility into your approach as much as possible as well. I think something that you touched on too, and that's really important, is that relationship piece. And it might not necessarily just be related to co-design. It's more applicable across the board really, to any work that you're doing. But actually being able to invest in developing relationships and developing trust is incredibly important. You can't come in and expect people to just provide you solutions and answers to the questions that you're seeking without actually spending time to really invest in developing a relationship and building trust and rapport. An auntie out at Dubbo told me about that as well when I went out last week. So that was actually, really good to reaffirm that approach. And to have that front and center really in my mind when I was doing engagement. And she said it far more eloquently and in a far more sophisticated and articulate manner, and more impactful manner than I am now. But she,
as most of our aunts often do.
She had this, the way she structured that information, and the way she provided that to me, that investment piece up front of having that discussion and investing in relationships and building trust and rapport. That's when you're going to get better outcomes. And that sometimes takes a while. Sometimes it comes quickly. Sometimes it doesn't. It depends on who you're consulting with. And everyone has different needs in that regard. So that needs to be factored into an approach, and really flexibility sort of needs to be factored in as well to ensure that it's done properly. It's hard, but it's also an really important part of any consultation piece, really.
Absolutely. It really makes me think about that relationship piece and that participation piece around. I was listening to a podcast on the way over here around CoDesign, and they talk about the around investing in community as part of CoDesign, around investing in supporting people's ability to participate. And creating that equity and access, which are core principles for us. They talk about, are there opportunities to fund community roles as part of a CoDesign project? And they really reminded me, because for me as well, doing so much work in this CoDesign space, and because there are so many aspects to meaningful co-design based on the community and the circumstances, you often forget sometimes as well, like not so much forget, but, maybe sometimes are paying more attention to different aspects of that. Because when it reminded me, like I was like thinking about some projects that we've got coming up, and I was like, oh, this isn't even front of center. Like there are real opportunities for us to potentially do that and do that really well. And how that can support more meaningful participation and engagement. How much as well I think about our communities being like our communities are often over consultated, and consultation fatigue is a real thing. So how can we create, engagement and co-design experiences where we're adding value? Core principles for us at Impact Policy is one of them is do no harm in everything that we do. And so if we're just coming in with another engagement experience, and
adding to that fatigue.
Old mate has been to 7 in the last sort of 6 weeks, how much we actually, adding value or doing harm. And so it made me think about that sort of stuff, because particularly like I was driving over here and I was thinking about, particularly for our communities too, around the timing and times of the year. And I started thinking about, I was like, oh, this project we're doing, it's coming up. It's August now when we're recording this, probably going to be September by the time we're out there. Well, it's a couple of weeks out from knockout. I was like, oh, maybe, I know there's 2 teams that represent that community in the knockout. I imagine they'll be coming together when we're out there. Maybe there's going to be, maybe we could invest in some sponsorship for some of those teams. And as part of that, host a community like forum with those teams at one training, or a community barbecue where we talk about what we're doing and we seek their advice around how that should look, and hold space for them to tell us anything they want to tell us about that sort of stuff. And but we're not just going in there expecting people to give us their time, give us their lived experience, give us their cultural knowledge. We're actively trying to look for a way where we can add value as well, and add resources as well as part of that. And particularly for our regional communities as well, there's a real opportunity for that to be done well. But yeah, just maybe I was driving over here and it was really just hearing that that point around participation and investment when thinking about co-design, and in a way that it's not about investment in from an economical sense. It's about, for me, when I think about it from an equity sense. For our people that they're juggling work, they're juggling family, they're juggling, a whole range of different things in their life. They might not have the capacity to be part of a consultation or co-design process, but how can we invest in something in community that might create a space for them to have a voice?
Yeah.
So it made me think about like I've played in knockout, you've been around football your whole life. We know what it's like when that time of year is coming up.
Yeah.
The whole community is together at those fields in those training sessions. There's a real energy in those couple of weeks in the lead up.
Yeah.
Like what other way to add value and invest in that sort of stuff, and maybe hold space for people that might want to have a voice that don't have the capacity to come to other stuff as well.
I think as well it's a recognition of subject matter expertise and the knowledge amongst Aboriginal communities, because I think a big part of it is also equity. So touching on what you said about investing time, energy, and also money into community to ensure they are able to participate in a manner that suits them, that doesn't disadvantage them, that provides the best the best outcomes for them, and allows them to have some agency. But also, we're going in and we don't want to be extracting information from them. We don't want to be mining their information and expertise.
Yeah.
There's got to be a more collaborative approach, and there's got to be more of a partnership approach, and that's how you start to begin those partnerships as well.
Yeah.
It's how you begin to be collaborative by being equitable, and for us, I think as well, it's being being truthful to what we preach. So it's a way for us to actually be honest and really reflect our commitment to that. But I think it's incredibly important, and something that I just didn't really touch on before as well. You need to start investing, and that means all of the above into having those conversations, and it's a mutually beneficial process.
Absolutely.
Right? Because your policy design is going to be more effective. It's going to be more beneficial. You're not going to have to then redesign something 2 years later because it's been an utter failure, and put all these resources into another shot in the dark and probably another flawed outcome. You're able to really address need, and then it's better for community because they have some agency themselves. They have a voice in what affects them, and it's not an altruistic process. It's not a. Often, people get into this sort of habit of thinking it's a social good or like some act of charity. It's not about that. It's actually about doing what's effective.
Yeah.
And if you want an outcome, if your purpose is to get the best outcome through policy design and make some positive impact in the world, then co-design is your method to do that.
Absolutely.
Co-design is your process for achieving that outcome.
That's
if
it.
it's done right.
Totally.
I reckon too, like a big part of it's probably, and I don't know what you think about it, but I'm not really one to be as values focused. I think that's probably a big shift between us. Like I see the benefit in that, but I tend to focus on other parts of policy development. I think the opposite when it comes to co-design. I think you need to have really strong principles for how you go about it. Like purpose is great, but principles is a must as well in a co-design approach, because if you're not following those principles, you're going to go off track.
Totally.
And you're not going to, it's really tenuous, a tenuous environment that you sort of find yourself in. And I'm more of the opposite, whereas I think purpose is actually, I tend to think purpose is more important, but in this situation, I would actually prioritize principles over purpose. So that's like a bit of a shift in my thinking and the way I do things, and that's probably just the way my mind works a little bit. But
that's a good point. It's I think it's an important point, and it coming back to when you talked about how we think about community and investing in community around equity and participation, and you made that point around like, it's not like an act of charity or anything to do that, and it made me think about the principle of investing in relationships.
Yep.
And we know that so much of what informs the basis of great co-design is really strong relationships.
Yep.
And so if organizations or people listening to this are thinking about, like, if you can shift that thinking around the principles of participation to be based around really strong relationships, and then investing in that, not only is that going to mean more stronger outcomes for the project that you're working on, but it's about taking a long-term view of what that investment looks like with that community.
Yep.
So, for example, like if we do a lot of work with the public sector, we're working with a government agency now at the moment to do a co-design piece, and if we invest in community as part of that process, then what I believe that will mean for us outside of this project, that the next time we come back into that community, our engagement and co-design ability to co-design and do that work well is going to be so much more stronger, because we've came into that community with strong principles around investing in meaningful relationships, adding value, doing no harm, being trauma-informed, being community-led, and all those things. But it's also the ability to think about that outside of your immediate purpose and project as well.
Yeah.
Because I know, like, hand on heart, the work that we're doing, the next time we go into that community after this, maybe the co-design might be so much more stronger or deeper as a result of the work that we've done now.
Yeah.
Because it's got to come back to some of those core principles around relationships. But you brought up principles. What would you say are, one or two sort of really core principles of co-design that you think, if someone's listening now and they want to take a principles-based sort of approach to how they think about it?
I think probably authenticity. I mean, I keep saying that, but maybe honesty as well. I think that there needs to be flexibility too. But in terms of principles, I'd certainly say authenticity. You've got to truly want to do this, and it's got to be. It can't be a PR exercise. It's got to be embedded into every phase, essentially, or every aspect. I mean, you could even, realistically, we probably should do co-design on the principles too with the people that you could probably workshop that too. So it's front and center of the project that you're working on, and it's kind of, then it's properly embedded into every aspect of the project that you're working on, and it's reflective of their needs and reflective of what they want. But I think as well, authenticity is something that I use because I think it's so often what we talked about before, it's become a dirty word because it hasn't been used properly. It's been used as a buzzword, essentially. It's been used to bolster the palatability of certain policies that have gone through a design process that was inherently flawed.
Yeah.
So it's really to paper over the cracks in the approach, and that's why
almost alleviate some accountability
yeah.
as well.
I mean, accountability is probably
the public and private sector.
Yeah, accountability is probably a good principle, actually. Now that you say it, because there is a level of accountability that particularly government or for us as consultants as well, that we have to be accountable to community. Because we really rely on
absolutely
on them for the work that we do. So that's probably actually the authenticity and accountability are probably my two. But yeah, I probably haven't put a heap of thought into what they should be, but that's something that I think I need to probably do a bit more and actually reflect on what the principles could be and how does that really guide the work, and how am I displaying that in every aspect of the work that we're doing. So
sounds like that resource we're building together
might be.
Because absolutely, I hear a lot of that coming through. I think one thing as well that we talked about, and that's coming up a bit, is evaluation of CoDesign, and building an evaluation process into something that is co-designed. And we talk about even that. We talk about who determines the success of something that's been co-designed.
Yep.
And often I think the default opinion of that will be that the people that are funding it will be the people that determine if it's been effective.
Yep.
And so how do we build in evaluation frameworks that make sure that communities still have agency in determining if it's been done well? And I think that's where some of the risk comes back to what you talked about with the public or private sector using co-design, and it almost sort of shirks some accountability in some spaces sometimes, is that there is no sort of evaluation piece built into determining if that has been done well or could be improved. And so I think that was something that we were sort of talking about recently in terms of how we start to think about that as well. But yeah, what sort of thoughts do you have around that sort of space when we think about, building that in as well as part of, thinking about co-design and building things together?
It can't be preemptive. And like you said, you can't predetermine what the measurements of success are. You certainly can't determine how, like, the method of data collection what the method of data collection is. You really need to, it's almost an additional part of the process, or potentially even a separate part of the process, because I feel that you can put it as part of the initial process of policy design, but I think there is an element where there is a need to then go back out to the GURI communities or the stakeholders, or the key people that are impacted by that policy, to understand what their measurements of success are, what they want to see evaluated, what the scope is for them, what the positives are for them and what the negatives are for them, and really develop your evaluation framework from there. Instead of it being, in a year's time we'll evaluate this and we'll determine the evaluation process and we'll determine the evaluations, like whether it's successful or not. That's where you get inconsistency. That's when things are often derailed, successful or not. And that's when, where I find knee-jerk decisions are made. And we all know, like, in a review process and an evaluation process, so much of it is determined by the scope and the framework that you develop.
Absolutely.
So there needs to be some level of community control in the framework that's been the evaluation framework. And like I said, the people that are impacted by the policy most need to have input into the evaluation framework. And that could include data collection. It could include, you could develop your data sovereignty sort of principles and processes from that. But I would say that it's something that needs to be essentially co-designed as well. So it's almost an additional step to the process. It's not something that you can kind of just go, we're going to evaluate it in a year and we're going to government or, non-Aboriginal organisations or entities will determine its success, because that's just doing business the way that it's continually done. And we know that's not effective. We know that's not efficient. We know that that hasn't worked. So, yeah. And I think there's a bit of fear around it too. Like, I think there's a bit of fear around relinquishing some control and power, but it's got to happen. For this to be effective, it's got to happen. And that includes relinquishing power and control of the evaluation process.
I think that reinforces some of the stuff you were touching on around the Productivity Commission as well.
Yeah.
Stuff that come out of that.
Same sort of principles, really, or the same sort of ethos and themes. Co-design's a method to meet some of the, probably a method or mechanism to meet to implement some of their recommendations, or a lot of their recommendations. And, when I was saying the evaluation process is flawed, or is often flawed, it sort of probably does touch on, the failure of closing the gap in many respects, in many areas. So
yeah, absolutely.
that's that's probably another whole other discussion as well that we could get
Do
into.
a whole another episode on that. But,
Yeah.
But it's really important as well what you talk to around informing evaluation, particularly of pieces that we've co-designed together, whether it's projects, whether it's policy, whatever that might be. Who is determining what success looks like, who's having a voice in informing how we understand that, and what sort of factors and social determinants might impact what well looks like. What good outcomes look like as well. And I think sometimes that's some of the, we touch on Close the Gap and, thinking about Productivity Commission and different things like that as well is that, there's often a different, metric for success, between government or the private sector and our communities.
Yeah.
And so often, and we see it all the time with particularly community projects that I'm digressing from co-design a bit here, but thinking from an evaluation perspective and designing and doing that work together, we see all the time community programs get abandoned because they don't meet certain evaluation metrics or they haven't been evaluated effectively. But when you have conversations more broadly in community, some of the outcomes that have been achieved aren't measured, or aren't quantifiable, and that they haven't been reflected in evaluation mechanisms and processes, and then we lose those projects that have been existing in community, whether they've only been there as a pilot or whether it's been shorter term. We really see the absence of that community voice in terms of understanding what success looks like. So, when you touch on that stuff around co-design, it just reinforces for me more broadly how critical it is that our people have a voice in determining what good looks like.
That's a perfect point too, because there's this bias towards quantitative data, really, I think, still. And often it's that anecdotal evidence that our mob provide, that qualitative data that our mob provide that's not as highly valued in an evaluation framework, or sometimes, not always the case. I think, the Wallomer stuff that you did with the evaluation framework is actually a good example of where it was valued, where that input and that personal sort of reflection piece that participants have is really sort of front and center, and really captures that qualitative data and that storytelling piece as well. So it's providing that, broader context that's often overlooked and not considered. And it's important because we have seen programs fall off because of a perceived lack of success, where we know that, there's not even that sort of interrogation of why something wasn't successful. I think I read an evidence base that Britt Jacobson wrote a few years ago.
Britt's had about 5 shout outs throughout the Impact Policy podcast series.
So she wrote something about, it was a case study that, a language program was deemed as a failure because it didn't create fluent speakers, or what was considered fluent speakers in a community, but the level of funding was so minimal that it was never going to. It only had, I don't know the exact number, but it was something like 20,000 for the year. So the level of expectation and the measurements of success it was just impossible to meet with that level of funding. But there was no sort of thinking around, well, why didn't it meet it? What were the reasons for it not meeting? And the reason essentially was because of a lack of funding. And I should note that was well before the Aboriginal Languages Trust was developed as well. So this is going back, a number of years now. About I think I read that evidence base in 2019. But it's still sort of something that's really stuck with me, because in previous roles that I've worked in, that had to be a consideration. Are there barriers in how this is set up that don't determine success, that prevent success from occurring? Is there bias in our evaluation framework, essentially, in the way that we're evaluating a program? And that's important to understand and probably be cognizant of. Again, a little bit different to co-design, but similar principles apply, I think.
Absolutely.
And I think co-design is a way to kind of ameliorate those issues as well. So yeah, again, like I use the word mechanism, or it's some sort of mechanism to address that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I can think of examples in community where, from a quantitative perspective, they've looked at numbers of participation not being high enough, as justification for funding, being removed. But then from a community perspective, those numbers that are engaged with are, dealing with complex needs, need a deep level of engagement and, program support that's provided. And so sometimes often, we see particularly public sector funded community-based programs forgetting about, or not forgetting, just not being conscious of the real interconnection and, complexity of needs that need to be addressed at a community level.
Yeah.
And so often they're not, we lose, some of the significant impact that's happening. And again, it comes back to some of those core principles as well as what we talk about when we talk about co-design. We talk about relationships being such a critical and central part, but that's not unique to co-design. That's it's across a range of different ways that we think about things. And so often, particularly for our communities and people that are listening along, like we've become so accustomed to projects, people, processes and policy just flying in and out of our communities, that often it's a period of like, we're not even talking about months sometimes, we're talking about years in terms of meaningful relationships and trust being built with people, with, projects and policymakers and professionals, to actually really get true meaningful participation. And, we see that sometimes with projects that are really just starting to build some momentum that just get quashed and removed. And it's funny that you mentioned Brit, who's had a shout out by like 5 different separate guests, which is what made me laugh that you said her name. But I was listening to a podcast on the way over here, and I mentioned in that podcast that I was talking to her about projects. She was talking about some work that she's doing on a co-design piece around some language work happening up on Gumbaynggirr country.
Yeah.
And we don't have to talk about that project specifically, but I remember I asked her like what makes you, like she used co-design, and I was like, oh yeah, like what makes you think it's co-design?
Yeah.
And her answer to that, which I thought was, really, really good, was that she's like, well, for starters, we've had a relationship with that organization, that program for a number of years. And so before we even started having conversations around this research and evaluation piece, we'd already had a really strong relationship and connection. So that when we started to build this piece of work, she was like, hand on heart could, authentically say that I feel like this has authentically been a co-designed process.
And it was something, I think I know the one that you're talking about, but I think as well it was something that community org or that community identified as a need anyway, before that sort of process came about. So there was already moves to progress it. It's just there was that alignment. Comes
back to that co-design, community-led principle we started with, at the beginning of this conversation. But sorry, I cut you.
No, that's it. Like, isn't it? Like, if that's a perfect example of it being community-led. There was an alignment of values, and there was, the understanding of need and aspiration in that. So yeah, like that's a really good example actually, of how to start something, or how something has been started, I should say. I think there's a lot of agency, or agent. I keep using that word. It's not the right word to use in this situation. I think there's a lot of potential, and capacity already in communities. So, a lot of the time it's about not getting in their way. Like, it's about actually just supporting them on their journey and kind of just recognizing that they can lead. And co-design might be a bit of a framework for that, but co-design might be a supportive piece as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sort of just formalizes it, or puts in mechanisms to actually support that journey and that progression. But I think that's also something that a lot of people need to really come to terms with.
Yeah. How do we get out of the way?
How do we get out of the way? And how do we add, I think something that you say a lot is how do we add value as well. So actually giving a lot of thought into how do we best add value instead of coming in and fucking things up.
Yeah. For lack of a better word. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's sort of, coming towards the end of our time for this episode, yarning about this. I think it's a really nice way to sort of bring that to the end. I think we've sort of come back to where we started when we talk about, community leading. And I think it's a really nice way to sort of leave people listening with some principles to think about. And I think I really like, how our communities can lead, our people can lead.
Yep.
And they are best placed to determine how something is built and designed, and we are there to be a part of that process together with them. So how, for I guess my challenge or question to people listening is how do you get yourself out of the way? How do you create a space where you might be facilitating a space, but you don't have to be the center of attention. You don't have to be the expert at the front.
Yep.
The people there are really the experts. And often, the real magic happens in getting out of the way and, in small spaces, hearing and understanding and, being invited in to add value where you can, but not feeling like you need to be the savior, for lack of a better word. So I guess I'll leave that with people listening along. Think about that question in the back of your head when you're creating these spaces and holding these spaces in communities. How can you get yourself out of the way? And it might be uncomfortable because there might be pressure for you to be doing that because that's how it's always been done, or that's how people might perceive that they're engaging you to do. But the real magic comes with giving our communities that space to lead. And I might ask you if you've got any parting questions or reflections or thoughts for people listening along to take away.
I was just sort of thinking about that, and there's probably two things as well. Like if thinking about that question and thinking how I would answer that. One is recognizing that self-determination is a right. It is a right for Aboriginal people and Nguri people. It's not about, it's not necessarily predicated on ability. It is an inherent right that should be afforded to us. So that needs to be front and center of any sort of work that you're doing with mob, and you need to uphold that right as best as possible. And once you realize that too, then you start to understand how mob have capacity, how mob are already leading this work in this space. The languages sector is probably a really good example of that as well. And they're already making strides essentially without you as well. And then the other one is to actively listen. So actually listening to what they need, what they want, what their sort of journey has been. Listening is a way to develop that relationship, build trust, but it's also a way to ensure that what you're doing is adding value. What you're doing is in alignment with that community's values and needs. It's a way for you to ensure that your policy design is effective, and that's there are multiple benefits, but essentially that's what it comes back to. And we could all do with actively listening, I think, a bit better in most aspects of life. So they're probably my two.
Professionally and personally.
Yeah. So they're probably 2 points that I'd make.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's a really nice way for us to wrap this episode. I think hopefully this is the start of some more consistent conversations we have around this. And I think the more work, the more projects and more communities that we do this with, the more we can share what we're learning along the way for other professionals and practitioners that might take some value from that as well. So I know I learn best by listening and hearing stories and understanding experiences. So hopefully some others following along can as well. So yeah, thank you, brother.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, let's go.
Too easy.